What's up, my guys, and welcome back to GearBlocks. Today, we're going to be taking a little look at a rock crawler we've been building on stream. So, the majority of this was built on stream, so if you would like to watch that, it is accessible there. However, I did do some detail work off camera to get this finished and finalized. Now, there are a few constraints I kind of gave myself for this build. Of course, this is the first rock crawler I was doing, so I wasn't really too worried about functionality. So it has some flaws, most of which come from the engine. I set myself the goal of creating a V6 small block and wanted to run the entire rock crawler off of it. Part of that goal was to intentionally have an underpowered engine. That way, things like the gearbox would shine a bit more because low gears would hopefully compensate for the engine. And while it does function, it is still underpowered, and as a result, I had to use some smaller wheels. Those smaller wheels meant that I had some worse ground clearance, and the axles themselves, because I went with a solid axle with a Watts linkage, which I really love, by the way. The actual clearance for these axles isn't the best, so it does get hung up on some stuff. In addition, one of the other issues I've been having is because of the amount of torque we're actually putting through these axles, the gears themselves start to slip. On the front, I do have a actual differential, but on the rear, I had to remove the differential and put it in a solid axle. And even then, the actual, I forget what you would actually call it in a real vehicle, the system that sends power to the front axle, despite being a direct geared linkage, still has slippage. The gears themselves, if I grab this up and fly in here. So essentially this is the rear axle going back and this is the front axle going forward. And on this side, I have a system which pushes these gears into place. Now this is reinforced, so there shouldn't be any flexing. However, somehow these 1x1 gears slip on each other. It may be a result of it just being 1x1 gears. I know 1x1 pulleys have that issue, but I wouldn't have expected it here. Now, that all being said, those are the flaws. Let's talk about what this vehicle does and does well. This is a V6 engine going into a 3-speed transmission plus reverse that goes into I keep forgetting what I want to call it. It's not a differential. Transfer case. That's the word I'm looking for. Goes into a transfer case for front and rear wheel drive. While the front axle is disengaged, so is its differential. So that way, your steering should be better. However, you are still working with a rear solid axle, so it's not the best. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. As well as there's actually a linkage that comes up to simulate the steering wheel. Now on this design, it is actually a linear actuator that's doing all the pushing, but the wheel does actually reflect all of the turning that is happening. Now let's look at the front suspension, and honestly both suspensions are nearly identical, minus the fact that the front axle does have a CV joint here for the actual turning portion, but it's just medium springs where these two are allowed to pivot, and then we actually have the Watts linkage, which I love the Watts linkage. It's such a simple system, but it works so well. Essentially what the Watts linkage is doing is it's preventing any side-to-side motion, only allowing the roll, the pivot that you see, and vertical motion. It prevents the axle from twisting in this direction. So if I were to pull on the wheel, it does resist that. There is some flex because these actual joints aren't completely solid. But it also, like I said, removes the side-to-side motion. So if I were to actually take this and remove one of these linkages, don't know why that's locked in place. Wait, there we go. Now, if I grab this, I can actually shift the body side to side. You can see it especially on this side. So that is the actual purpose of the Watts linkage. Let's see if I can get that linkage back. Control Z until... There we go. Till it, for some reason, doesn't attach properly. Interesting. There we go. Now, let's actually put this to use and go through the controls. It's using the same control system that almost all my other vehicles use. If you hold G, you will start the engine. This engine does not have a stopping system to it. If you press 1, you will turn off the parking brake and go into drive. Shift and control are your transmission. And then 2 will engage the front axle. And from there, W, A, S, and D does what you'd expect it to. Now, while in first gear, it's really easy to redline the engine. It's purely there for the torque that it creates. And then second, third, top speed of this vehicle is around 55 miles an hour. I would not recommend going that speed. But if I go into first, is more than happy to go over these, which isn't much, to be honest. But if I get this turned around and we get a single wheel on here, you can see just how much the suspension is allowed to flex. And it can actually flex more than this. This isn't even pushing it to its limit. Honestly, I'm really happy with how the suspension has turned out and how much flex it actually has. Now then, let's actually take this and put it into its home habitat. And here we come up to the rocks. I am still in third gear, so we are probably going to hit a limitation to how much torque third gear can actually put out. Now there's a few tricks that this is using. One, there's weights in the front wheels. Oop. That is supposed to help with rolling. Or we did lift the front end because I shifted wrong. But also, the actual CV joints that are connecting the powertrain to the axles are doubled up. So there's actually 2 CV joints there that are sitting inside of each other. And there's connections to make sure they don't explode. Because genuinely, the CV joints in this game are extremely underpowered, and unfortunately they seem to be the best way to transmit power. Oh, come on. And here you can start to see that one flaw. Too much physics. The one flaw that we had, where the front axle, despite being directly linked with just solid gears, slips so much more than the rear axle does. Let's get the engine started again. Let's try this one more time. So I'm not sure how much of this is just, yes, the engine is underpowered and that is a problem, but also how much of this is just we're breaking the physics of the game because gears are just buckling and CV joints are just exploding and things are not working the way they should logically work. Now I could be missing something. But also, it's kind of frustrating. Now, I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but just like all my other builds, this vehicle does work entirely with energy consumption turned on. As you can already see, there's fuel tanks there behind the seats. It does have an alternator, it does have batteries and all of that. Everything should be hooked up correctly, so if you don't want to play this with the energy consumption turned on, it will work. And I'm very interested in actually doing like a V2 of this, trying again to fix a lot of those flaws and make something that is significantly better with what I've learned about this design. I already have quite a few things I want to change and improve, so if you want to see that, let me know. And as we come to the top of the mountain, I am going to be ending this here. Thanks for stopping by. Thanks for sticking around. And until next time, peace.